The earliest known and surviving photograph containing a person was a daguerreotype created by Louis Daguerre of the Boulevard du Temple. Although only 2 people are seen upon the street view, the Boulevard du Temple was actually quite busy while the image was being captured. The exposure time for the daguerreotype took 10 minutes at a minimum, and the pair of people, a man paying a shoe shiner to polish his shoes, were the only individuals to stay in place long enough to be represented in the photograph. Although Louis Daguerre's eponymous photographic device only produced still images, the process of creating his pictures were similar to the way a motion picture would later be created. A lot of movement before the mechanism that attempted to physically express the light before it. It would take 50 years later for the inventor Louis Le Prince to fabricate the first moving picture in 1888, the Roundhay Garden Scene, a scene that displayed apparitions swirling inward towards the back of a garden space, with a running time, depending on the copy, of between 1.66 and 2.11 seconds, containing a number of 20 to 52 frames. Within the next years later, Thomas Edison would produce a series of films using a device he invented called the kinetograph. 2 examples, both produced in 1894. First, Sandow the Strongman, just like a cinematic atom, gave the viewer the spectacle of a muscular man flexing. Second, Annabelle's Serpentine Dance, a film version of Eve, featured a woman swirling fabric about and dancing. Another 2 years later, in 1896, Auguste and Louis Lumière would use their Vitascope to produce a cavalcade of films that oppose Edison's spectacles of wonder with scenes of the ordinary. A pair of films exemplifying this are Workers Leaving the Lumière Factory, a film revealing the exiting of people from the inventor's populated factory, and the arrival of a train at La Ciotat Station, an everyday event that unintentionally frightened its viewers, all unacquainted to the abilities of film, into believing an actual train was heading towards them. The entirety of these films by both Edison and the Lumière brothers had yet to portray a story. It wasn't until Alice Blatch placed together a film, The Cabbage Fairy, in 1896, that an actual narrative was expressed. But it was another person of France, the father of special effects, Georges Méliès, that advanced the idea of film used to tell a tale. He also discovered by accident the ability to cut frames in order to create the illusion of one thing changing to something else. And with this technique, he created many films, one being 1896's The Haunted Castle, the first horror film. Méliès continued to make his fantastical narrative films, and Thomas Edison followed Méliès's achievements soon after by producing films with stories also. In 1902, the same year Méliès released his famous picture, A Trip to the Moon, Thomas Edison released his most notable film, The Great Train Robbery. But where Méliès strictly shot all his films on a set and kept the editing minimal to a single scene, Edison Studios' key film director, Edwin S. Porter, improved the way a narrative film was created by going on location and cross-cutting between shots. 8 years later, another Edison Studios director, J. Searle Dawley, would match Millet's deceptive film techniques by the use of reverse motion as a special effect, for what could have possibly been the first instance of this, in order to create the illusion of Frankenstein's monster being brought to life in his 1910 film adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And in 1915, T.W. Griffith surpassed Edison's established filmmaking techniques when he created the very influential A Birth of a Nation. The film, with its disgusting opinions on race, is well known for being highly controversial, but unfortunately had an admirable aesthetic value, making it one of the first art films. The majority of respected films after The Birth of a Nation were directly guided by D.W. Griffith's ideas on filmmaking. He also created film realism, ironically in spite of his film being politically based on a huge lie. Many comedies were being released during this time, and a group of the first silent clowns were getting their start, Charlie Chaplin and Fatty Arbuckle amongst them. All of Chaplin's films, like 1916's The Champion, were shorts. The same goes for Fatty Arbuckle's films such as 1917's Coney Island. Chaplin wouldn't have a full-length feature film until the release of 1921's The Kid, and Arbuckle's first feature-length film, Leap Year, which was completed in 1921 but delayed due to a scandal, wasn't released until 1924. Over in Europe during the early 1920s, while the major portion of the world was free to experience the films of other countries, an isolated Germany developed their own films based on establishing moods, expressing emotion, and escapism, appropriately called German Expressionism. This movement inspired two popular horror films during the time: The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920, and Nosferatu in 1922, each which would begin a number of film techniques in the genre, such as crooked lines and dark shadows. In the same year as Nosferatu, the first documentary, Nanook of the North, was released. The film documented the life of an Inuit hunter and his family while they survived in the Canadian Arctic. And although many of the events in the film were staged, this was the start of film attempting to relay the daily personal happenings of an actual person. Around this time in the country of Russia, the film directors focused their film values around editing, and they invented the montage. One of these directors, Sergei Eisenstein, made the montage famous with his 1925 film Battleship Potemkin. The film includes one of the greatest montages ever made, in which a group of Cossacks march down the Odessa steppes, firing on unarmed civilians. Returning back to Germany and its expressionist movement, in 1927, Fritz Lang's film Metropolis came out and set the foundation for every science fiction film after. Another film that arrived in 1927, more renowned for its advancements in filmmaking more than for its actual content, although in a discussion you can focus on how politically incorrect it is, was The Jazz Singer, the first talkie. With the existence of a film that included synced sound, this made a silent picture less appealing to the average moviegoer, and many silent pictures were canceled and their actors were placed out of work. But some silent pictures remained, especially in the foreign markets, though they were less successful than the talkies. A straggler to the end of the silent picture era was the 1928 film The Wind. The film was panned by critics and reported financial losses from the box office, although it was positively reviewed by British critics, but it is now often considered one of the best silent films. One of Germany's later silent films, 1929's Pandora's Box, also found little success and was critically panned. But during the 1950s, the film was rediscovered and reconsidered to be one of Germany's great cinematic masterpieces. Many of the first surrealist films were created during the silent era's last days as well, such as Francis Un Chien Andalou, also dated from 1929, which was directed by Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali, and received praise for its originality to both Buñuel's and Dali's surprise. Still focused on Europe, a good amount of silent directors lost their occupation with the arrival of sound. but the German director Fritz Lang showed he was able to transition well enough to the talkies by making the great noir film 1931's End, a movie that strengthened the themes of its genre more than any other. Back in Hollywood, Universal Studios were adjusting well to creating sound pictures. They had been making monster films since 1923's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, followed by 1925's The Phantom of the Opera, and with their new sound equipment, they intended to release more of their monsters upon the world with two films in 1931. Dracula, and Frankenstein, each which received very positive reviews.
No, you're hurting me! No!
Both of the films were recorded on quiet sets using Movietone, which is a sound-to-film device, opposed to Vitaphone by Warner Brothers that recorded sound to disc, the same system used to make The Jazz Singer.
Come in. Come in.
It was so fitting for the first talkie to be a musical that studios began to produce more of them, and the demand and production value began to rise also. And one of the true greats of these films was choreographer and director Busby Berkeley, who made extravagant dance numbers with expensive designer props, as can be seen in such films as Gold Diggers of 1933. This musical was created at the end of the pre-code era, so it contained elements considered too vulgar for some of the audience at the time, and it was one of the first films to be toned down and censored in certain states. Another pre-code film a year later in 1934 was one of the first examples of a screwball comedy. It Happened One Night.
Do you mind if I try?
You? Don't make me laugh.
The film was expected to not do well by its production company, director, and actors, and despite getting good reviews by most critics, didn't perform well in the major film houses. But once it reached the secondary theaters, the film's popularity grew and motivated more studios to produce screwball comedies. The next year, in 1935, the first live-action three-strip Technicolor film, Becky Sharp, was released. Although the film is little known and not very popular, it should be noted that the movie was a step in showing what color film was capable of.
Oh, well, there's too much bad poetry in the world anyway. Oh, they'll all laugh at me. Oh, how they'll laugh. Oh.
But it wasn't until 1937 when two films, both expensive to produce, showed the true marvel of color film. Gone with the Wind?
Red, you go. Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
And The Wizard of Oz.
Now, my beauty, something with poison in it, I think. With poison in it, but attractive to the eye and soothing to the smell. Poppies. Poppies will put them to sleep. Sleep. Now they'll sleep.
Many filmmakers still chose the less expensive black and white film, though. One of them being Orson Welles. Welles became instantly famous after a radio broadcast of War of the Worlds and was given a contract by RKO Radio Pictures to create a film. His first two scripts were rejected by RKO, but they accepted his proposal on Citizen Kane, a lampoon on real-life powerful media mogul William Randolph Hearst. The film was considered a flop in due of it not receiving any advertising or publicity, because Hearst didn't appreciate its opinions towards him and used his position to restrict promotion of the movie. But once the film was rediscovered later, it was treated as a masterpiece for its great story, cinematography, and acting. It is usually first or next to first on lists of the greatest films ever made. The year prior to this, in 1940, another famous person was being lampooned by an older face, for a good reason. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator was released.
Out Caesar, out Nolus, Emperor of the world.
It was an open mockery of Adolf Hitler when the US was still at peace with Germany, and Hollywood was actually afraid to offend Germans, as Hollywood gained a lot of money from Germany's patronage. Chaplin was able to show how strong an opinion can be expressed through the power of film with his creation. In 1942, another monumental film inspired by World War II arrived, which was Casablanca, a film that truly represented the zeitgeist. The movie was completely an American film, but contained an international cast with few born Americans and many German expatriates, including Conrad Veidt of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Peter Lorre of M. Perhaps this was a way of reminding every born American that German Americans belonged here like everyone else. During World War II, Hollywood received a large economic increase, which helped to maintain our U.S. tradition of grand film productions, filled with expensive special effects and props. And the production of these films would continue after the war was finished. But over in Europe, especially Italy, their post-war attitude desired to display reality and their sentiments towards their existing condition, which was basically poverty. From this, Italian neorealism was born, a film movement characterized by its non-professional actors, on-location filming, and its stories of everyday life, oppression, and injustice, exemplified in one of the film movement's greatest films, 1948's The Bicycle Thief. As for the post-war Far East, a U.S.-occupied Japan was experiencing something different. The U.S., afraid that communism would spread from China to Japan, wanted to make certain to assist in Japan's economic recovery, and during the 50s, America was able to create an economic boom in their former enemy's country. An effect of this was the discovery of Japanese cinema by the West, which was little known about prior. And the first film to be given attention was Akira Kurosawa's 1950 film Rashomon. Now, cinema encompassing the entire world had finally been achieved. Also during this time, back in the US, movies were beginning to get self-reflexive and explored the past history of filmmaking.
I can't go on with the scene. I'm too happy. Mr. DeMille, do you mind if I say a few words? Thank you. I just want to tell you all how happy I am to be back in the studio, making a picture again. You don't know how much I've missed all of you. And I promise you I'll never desert you again. Because after Salome, we'll make another picture and another picture. You see, this is my life. It always will be.
First, 1952's Sunset Boulevard focused on Hollywood and the fall of their silent stars upon the creation of the talkie.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
And then 1952's Singin' in the Rain musically elaborated on the subject, showing with euphonic songs and dance numbers that the silent films were necessary to be surpassed. Thank you for your time. This has been a brief history of film before 1952, with some shots and scenes reperformed by me and my dog, with help from my mom and dad, strangers, and a barber.